this webinar on the difference between next generation science standards and the current New Hampshire science standards. My name's Francis Vidgen. I'm the CEO here at NOADM, and I'm a former teacher. I spent several years as a high school math teacher and teaching 9th grade through 12th grade, honors, college prep, the whole gamut. And then I went on, as part of my work at NOADM, I had the opportunity to be a teacher in New Hampshire in SAU 50 for, I believe, 5 years or so, teaching kindergarten through 6th grade. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But my role here at NOADM is in part to help communicate really why STEM. We talk about this word STEM, and it's potentially just another education sort of term that it's an acronym that could sort of go by the wayside. However, science, technology, engineering, and math, which is what STEM stands for, is something that is the really perfect venue for teaching higher order thinking skills. And those higher order thinking skills are things that every student needs, which is why teaching science and engineering is so important from the earliest grade levels on up. From a workforce development standpoint, when students have mastered creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, they're really ready for any career or college choice, regardless of whether it's in science, technology, engineering, or math. At the end of the day, it's all school, and those higher order thinking skills are really valuable in all content areas and really empower students for the rest of their lives. So that's why STEM. Sort of the next piece, though, is how. And so by putting students in the role of scientist and engineer, we can really empower them to engage in the practices of science and engineering, but also to develop those higher order thinking skills in context, hands-on with the content, and actually use the skills not only to access the content, but to participate in developing it in their own classroom in an age-appropriate sort of way. So that boils down to essentially curriculum materials and some form of professional development that we all have to engage in as educators and as administrators to make that happen. And so this session today is sort of a look at what is in these next generation science standards in terms of how they're constructed, how they really transform that classroom inquiry environment, and thinking about how it's taking, in some ways, the New Hampshire science standards that currently exist a step further. And the resources are really useful for engaging students in inquiry and the other sort of domains that we currently have in New Hampshire. But as we take a look forward, we'll see how next generation is sort of redefining that. The kind of approach we're going to take here is basically spend the next 45 minutes looking at what differentiates science and engineering, teaching and learning in this sort of STEM cycle, and how the 3 dimensions of next generation science standards combine in a way that really redefines inquiry, and specifically the inquiry environment in the classroom. And there are elements of this, sort of taking a look at the agenda, that the next generation science standards are in a way tougher. They make links intentionally to Common Core math and ELA, and they shape the methods for science instruction K through 12 in a sort of a new way. And again, back to that idea that really we're dealing with school, not an acronym, and skills and higher order thinking that's useful across disciplines. When we hear this new other acronym, which is a little bit lesser known, STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, and I'm sure there's somebody with an even longer algorithm, version of this out there throwing history in. We're going to take a look at what art in ways that we can use science and engineering to engage art as well. So without further ado, let's kind of blast ahead. The next generation science standards are sort of a product of the National Research Council and the National Academies of Science and Engineering, and research that they did that goes back even before 2007 and has sort of been dripping out over time and evolving eventually in this 26-state effort to develop the next generation science standards, which are standards, like all standards. They're not curriculum, and we can talk about the difference of that between those. But what it does is the next generation science standards draw really clear lines between what is science, what's engineering, what's scientific knowledge and technology, and the role of math. And they kind of form a cycle. So what you see on your screen here is that cycle. The definition of science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists answer questions by forming hypotheses and developing experiments to test those hypotheses. Now, we're not saying that science is linear and that discoveries don't just sort of happen, but scientific knowledge is knowledge from experimentation, and the methods and practices of scientists are to really set out to use experiments to answer questions, and so they test hypothetical answers, and the data that comes out of those tests is data that they can use to essentially discover whether their hypotheses are proven or disproven or confirmed or not. And so scientists build the body of scientific knowledge, and engineers use their scientific knowledge to solve problems. So in the context of the next generation science standards, engineering is about problem solving and developing prototypes of solutions that may solve problems and actually testing those. And the testing of those prototypes should yield quantitative data, so data that is math-oriented, something that's measured, can be analyzed and evaluated in order to reflect back on that prototype and to decide whether the prototype should be refined or replicated. So that prototype, if it solves the problem and it is replicated or is scaled up, that is technology. So engineers solve problems by basically designing or producing technology, at least the first one, prototyping it, and then it gets sort of made in factories or something like this. But engineers design technology to solve problems. And so this becomes a full cycle because that technology then enables scientists to ask deeper questions, answer questions that have been out there that haven't been able to be answered, and form new questions. So an example of this right now is the probe that's orbiting Pluto. That technology didn't exist 30 years ago. And until the probe was developed and tested and then actually deployed, scientists did not have the technology to answer a lot of questions that we had about Pluto. And so now, as a result of that technology, those questions are being answered, hypotheses are being tested, data is gathered, and so scientific knowledge is growing. And perhaps in some way, engineers will be able to use that to develop some new technology down the road. Now, technology also sort of iterates. If you think about glass bottles are technology, but so aren't plastic bottles. So with the knowledge of plastic, engineers can design bottles with different properties that may be more useful in schools than glass or in other environments. So kind of thinking about this as sort of a macro cycle, these definitions really help delineate what the different disciplines are and the different roles that sort of emerge in STEM. And from a standards perspective, it really brings clarity to what inquiry is, what STEM practices are, and what it means to actually engage in science and in engineering versus just learning about it or mimicking it. Now you see math in the center. Math is a tool for communication, so it allows us to quantify our observations. So not just qualitative observations like it's bluish or bubbly or fizzy or whatever. It actually allows us to measure, to say it's grown by 5 centimeters or it precipitated 15 milliliters of water. those sort of quantitative observations allow us to do analysis and observation and also communicate with other people the exact findings and outcomes of the experiments or tests that we've done as scientists or engineers. So math makes it clear. Math makes tests in testing prototypes, test procedures, or procedures for scientific experiments replicable as well. So a tool for communication, a tool for forming procedures and precision and replicability. So keep that in mind sort of as we kind of move ahead here. And I guess just as a piece, a takeaway here, from a classroom perspective, students and teachers should be on the same page. They should really be able to say, hey, that's, you know, we're answering a question, we're using an experiment to do that, here's why, here's the methodology essentially that we're using. That's science. In an engineering context, if we're solving a problem, that's engineering. And should really understand the relationship between all these parts, really foundationally. Here's a screenshot from the Next Generation Science Standards. So what these Next Generation Science Standards are is actually performance expectations, which is different than sort of the traditional standard. A traditional standard is that a student should be able to distinguish between, or to know, or identify, and you sort of fill in the blank. Kind of very fact-oriented. A performance expectation is what we would think of more as an inquiry standard. It's something that a student who has reached proficiency as a result of classroom learning should be able to demonstrate in context, or in a relevant context. So here's one on the screen. So this is the performance expectation. A student should be able to develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. This is the 5th grade level standard from life science. Now, as a science teacher, if you're a science teacher, have a science background, you might look at that and say, oh, okay, movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment, that's a food chain or food web. And you're right. But the way the Next Generation Science Standards help define the context, they do it in 3 dimensions, which are these 3 colored boxes you see at the bottom of the screen here. On the left side is science and engineering practices. These are the skills specific to the discipline or disciplines of science and engineering. So think of these as the skills that students need to have or have developed in order to engage in demonstrating their understanding. They're going to do that in the content context of the disciplinary core idea, which is the center box in orange. So the disciplinary core ideas are sort of the content area, so we would think of it as life science or physical science. However, the content that's involved in these disciplinary core ideas is content that has a system level relationship. So it's not isolated factual knowledge, but it is content that is sort of living and breathing and connected to other areas of content. So when you look at this one in particular, you can see here, just in the first sentence of the first disciplinary core idea, the food of almost any kind of animal can be traced back to plants. Organisms are related in food webs in which some animals eat plants for food and other animals eat the animals that eat the plants. So without going any further, you can already see that the concept here is the connection between the parts of the ecosystem and how they consume energy and matter, and how that is sort of transferred. So you can see sort of the system level. And then when you look at sort of the other standard here, cycles of matter and energy transfer in ecosystems, we're not just sort of talking about the matter, but actually we're foreshadowing the relationship between the transfer of matter in a system and also energy. So you can think of the context for this as being a picture of a forest where there's plants and the sun's shining and there's deer eating the plants, and then maybe there are, I don't know, wolves or coyotes sort of as part of this scene as well. Maybe it's a little, maybe get a little graphic here, but you know, the idea is that the student should be able to explain that the coyote is going to get its energy, or its food, from the deer, and the deer got its energy and its food from the grass, and the grass got, or the other plants, and those plants got their energy from the sun and their matter from the soil. And so they're not taking apart a model, but they're actually developing it through their understanding of the concept and their use of the skills, the practices, which you see here in blue, the ability to develop a model to describe the phenomenon. So that's the phenomenon. How is the wolf able to live? Where does it get its energy? And the third box that you see is a cross-cutting concept. So cross-cutting concept is something that we sometimes refer to as systems thinking. It's how the content has a system-like behavior. So you think of, by increasing an input, you increase an output. That's an example of a system behavior. In this case, a cross-cutting concept is the idea that a system can be described in terms of its components and how they interact. So the components are the organisms, and their interactions is what they eat and how that energy or matter flows through the system. So a big key difference here between next generation science standards and the existing New Hampshire standards are that inquiry is not all on its own. And the context and the concepts, those concept standards, are not in isolation. They're really blended, and they're blended really well so that you can transform that time on learning into an environment where students are engaging in a context, and they're doing it using skills, and they're taking those skills to actually interact with the content instead of trying to just memorize it. And through that process, they're practicing what they will ultimately be required to demonstrate, which is that performance expectation. So the difference between curriculum and standards in this case is that the next generation science standards have grade-specific recommendations, but the thing is that those standards are not owned by the grade levels. The thing is that they need to be mastered by that grade level, by the end of that grade level. But the job of curriculum is to make all those connections intentionally, to bring the content to life, to do it in a way that scaffolds from September through June, and then from pre-K all the way through grade 12. So the next generation science standards actually make that a lot easier. These standards are much easier to group. The practices are very clear, the disciplinary core ideas are very clear, the cross-cutting concepts are very clear, but it requires sort of a new model of instruction because worksheets and fact memorization and showing something that's cool isn't going to cut it, because knowing about scientists and engineers and what they've done isn't enough. Those things do not engage students in the practices. So what are the practices? Here at a real high level are the 8 STEM practices, and think of these things as things that students need to be able to do, or from a student's perspective. So a student needs to be able to ask a question in a scientific context. They need to be able to define a problem in an engineering context. They need to not only be able to use a model, but actually develop it. So again, back to that food chain. We're not showing a food chain. Can a student actually identify and come up with the concept of the model of a food chain based on their skill set and knowledge from what they've learned? Not only carrying out an investigation, but planning it. So we're not doing something and then writing about it. That's journaling. We're actually planning out that investigation using a scientific or an engineering process and then carrying it out. So it's very purposeful. Not only interpreting data that's given to us, but analyzing it, using it to support a claim of some type. Using computational mathematical thinking to look for outliers, structure processes. A process is something like a procedure. So students need to be able to do that for themselves. These are all skills that they need to develop as a result of instruction. Be able to construct an explanation in the scientific context, or design a solution in an engineering context. So this is sort of your hypothesis and prototype. Engaging an argument from evidence is, once you have that hypothesis or prototype, it's the data you've gotten. Can you use it to support a claim, whether that hypothesis is true or false, or the prototype should be scaled, or refined. And obtaining, evaluating, communicating information is sort of part of this sort of whole scientific engineering process, start to finish. So the STEM practices are skills for developing scientific knowledge and developing technology. So it's a little different than what you would think of when we talk about STEM, because the T is in there. It's not about technological literacy in terms of experience with a platform. It's about the actual development process for creating, for identifying problems and then going about creating solutions to those problems in a data-based method, essentially. So here are a couple of my students from years ago, and they are engaged here. So this would be like 5th graders. They're engaged as engineers. So the way that we have used these in New Hampshire previously, so these students are actually New Hampshire students, we've been using these practices and processes for a while. How are we able to do that? Because we've been really keeping an eye on what the National Research Council has been publishing all the way back to 2007, so the evolution of standards nationally. And then as the next generation science standards have come out and have gone for public comment, we're incorporating that early work as well. Not so much from a trying to be prepared for the legislation, but really because they're just great things for kids to be engaged in. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, we're all teachers or in education to create opportunity for children, to move them to a better place in their lives, September through June, and 1st grade through 12th grade, so that they really are able to make the biggest dent, a positive dent in society as a result of what we do. At least that's why I'm a teacher. And so the way we have gone about this, and that has really proven very successful with tens of thousands of students, and even in the US and abroad, is to start with that nonfiction reading piece. And that can be something assigned for homework, and we've developed all these resources, so we have all of this stuff. But it's not just sort of me suggesting that you go do this. We put our money where our mouth is. We've done it. So there's that nonfiction reading piece, but then that's a common background. How do you take that and connect it to your community, whether it's rural or urban, and to the students' experiences? You need Socratic dialogue. And what that is it's artfully questioning. It's asking those higher order questions that require students to create and evaluate and analyze in their answers and to feed off one another as a way of sort of activating learning, and then using those skills. So you're introducing those STEM practice skills and requiring the students to use them like you see the students using them here, to go about defining the problem, taking it apart, considering what they know, and then begin thinking about solutions, choosing one, designing the prototype. And this is, you know, we're not talking about CAD design. I mean, you can go that route if you want, but simple sketches. And then carrying that plan out, testing, gathering the data, and forming a conclusion about what they've done. So in a classroom environment, these students are working as pairs. They have their lab notebook in front of them. They're engaged in the engineering design process. They're surveying their materials. And they're bringing their ideas to life. And their ideas will be different than all the other teams in the class. And their data will be different than all the other teams in the class. So part of this is a debrief at the end where they share their conclusion and their ideas and their prototypes, and other students consider what they've done and their data and their claims. And there's this sort of collegial comparison. And that's really, really important because it hits ELA skills, it hits math skills, it hits STEM skills, but it's a life skill as well. And that's how we really are integrating not only science but math and ELA in the context of higher order thinking. Those creative, evaluative, and analytical skills are useful in every content area. The things that are only science are really just that hands-on experimenting or prototyping itself. When the students are developing their plans, they're actually developing a nonfiction text. when they're reading, sort of kicking off class, that nonfiction reading component, that's nonfiction reading, that's ELA. And there are elements amidst all of this, which are the ELA technical standards from Common Core. On the math side, they're basically living out a math problem, like a word problem. Think of it that way. They're taking those Common Core math practices and they're actually engaging them in a hands-on context, which is fantastic because it's applied math. They're collecting data, they're graphing, and so again, they're using all of their knowledge and skills in multiple content areas, which is what we want. The next generation science standards, much more than the existing New Hampshire standards, require students to engage higher order thinking and sort of these skills and content simultaneously. It's not able to be siloed, and if you do silo it, then it's not as effective. And so traditionally Bloom's taxonomy, lowest order to highest order, is remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. In the case of next generation science standards, that creating, evaluating, and analyzing happens simultaneously, because when you picture the two children in that scenario where they're being scientists and engineers in the class, they have to evaluate and analyze the question. They have to apply what they've learned in the background from the reading and their understanding and what they remember from the discussion. But they then have to create a plan, evaluate it based on the data that they collect, so they're analyzing that data, and also create a conclusion, which they will sort of present and defend with their peers. And the thing is that this is not like a grand ordeal in terms of a 3-month project that students do one lab in 3 months. I mean, this is something that is happening on a regular basis, you know, kind of like every other week. You're doing sort of a full lab, and on a weekly basis, you're engaging all these practices in some context, so that way there, students are not learning by doing in the sense of replicating what somebody has shown them, but they're learning by being scientists and engineers, and that's key. Just to kind of show some of the quick connections between these, the sort of next generation standard design and what the standards are as they've been sort of published in final form and what the different states are adopting. And with the standards in New Hampshire being 9 years old, there's already talk of considering, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel within New Hampshire, to update the New Hampshire standards potentially by adopting at a legislative level the next generation science standards. Again, because they fit so well not only with 21st century skills, but also these other standards that have been adopted in New Hampshire already. So from a Common Core ELA standpoint, in a next generation science class, students are using evidence to support their analysis and evidence from text. That's an ELA technical subject standard. They are providing an accurate summary distinct from prior knowledge, and that's within the text that they've read, but also the discussion and the actual text they've created in their plan. That's an ELA technical subject standard. Expressing information visually in terms of a graph or table, that's an ELA standard. So it's one that really crosses over between science and math as well. I missed one here. Following precisely a multi-step procedure. A lot of times people think, oh, you know, if I give this procedure to the students and they do it, they're doing a lab. By some people's definition, that's a lab, but actually following a multi-step procedure is an ELA lab. It's not a science lab, and that's important to kind of point out here. It doesn't mean it has no value. It's just from a scientific perspective, that creating that multi-step procedure is the value. Distinguishing among facts, reason, judgment, and findings from research. When students are forming those conclusions, they're generating ELA text, which meets this middle school standard as well. And there's a bunch others, but just pointing out a few. Math Common Core practices, making sense of problems, persevering in solving them, happening with NGSS. Reasoning abstractly and quantitatively happens in that NGSS classroom. Constructing a viable argument and critiquing the reasoning of others. A viable argument is evidence-based, happening in an NGSS environment. modeling with math that is in the analysis of the data. It's also in the procedures that the students are creating as part of their plans. Using tools strategically. Are the students using the right mathematical operations? Is it comparing the two averages, looking for the difference? Is it is the procedure collecting the right information? Is it going to yield the right information? Are we measuring the right things? Attending to precision. Are we using the right standards when we are collecting data? Are we, as students, using the right number of decimal points? It's not about adding more to something. It's about adding 5 grams or adding 10 milliliters. That precision matters. It matters in procedures, it matters in the way we collect data, and it matters in the way we form our arguments. And so that's a math practice, but it's also very relevant to science and should be part of that environment. Looking for and making use of structure, again, procedures, methodologies, the processes themselves. And looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. One kind of common ELA process writing assignment is sending students home to create a procedure for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And it's one we all have fun with when students come back with a 100-step procedure and we try it in class and we don't end up with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The reality is that students should be learning in science that procedures are logical, but they're also efficient. And so you can create what's called recursive steps. And this is also true in computer science, where sometimes you repeat steps 1 through 5 for 4 more trials. And then maybe you repeat steps 1 through 6 with corn instead of rice. By doing that, you take large procedures and you reduce them to very few sort of operational steps, and you express repeated regularity, and that is a very important skill to develop in terms of logic and reasoning. It's a math practice. So the next generation science standards give us, and it really comes from the National Research Council all the way back to 2011, but it's really infused throughout, a new definition of STEM instruction, and it's one that I think educators should be excited about. There's always going to be the realities of the school day and resources and things like this, but at heart, with what we're trying to accomplish with children in terms of bringing them to a better place, this new definition of effective STEM instruction, I think, empowers teachers, it empowers administrators, it empowers students, but we need to take advantage of that. And so let's take a look at this definition. Effective STEM instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences. It identifies and builds on what they know and provides them with experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. This is very intentional language. So just to kind of unpack it here, capitalizing on students' early interest and experiences means that we're starting early. We're not trying to implement science the year that students are tested in science. That's not when it becomes a priority. For some districts and some schools, that's when it becomes a priority, and that's unfortunate. And the data will reflect that students really haven't been nurtured, that their experience isn't really deep, and it hasn't been very long. So by identifying and building on what students know, what we're doing is, and that's the next part of this, is that we are intentionally nurturing students' interest, their experience, their curiosity, and so we're scaffolding these concepts September through June, and also from pre-K all the way to grade 12. And that's intentional. And so that way there, from the user's experience, and here the user's the student, they get a really deep understanding of what that STEM cycle is, what those parts of STEM are, and those practices. They really become good at developing those practice skills and being able to apply them in any context. And what that means is they're able to answer any question, solve any problem methodically. It doesn't mean they have all the answers, but it means that they're able to approach it scientifically, or the way an engineer would. And that's why it says here that experiences engage the students in the practices of science, and you can throw engineering in there, and sustain their interest. So If the student is not being engaged in the practices, and those practices back to those 8 practices, if they're not being engaged in the practices, then they are not engaging in they are not being engaged in effective STEM instruction. So showing a video, a simulation, something like that where students are not involved in defining problems, asking questions, developing models, planning, analyzing, constructing, arguing from evidence, they're not doing science, and it's not effective STEM instruction. Sustaining student interest is about engaging content, but it's also about an engaging scope and sequence. It's not about doing a unit for 3 months. It's about slicing, sort of chunking your year in ways that you're grouping standards and then delivering units around those groups of standards with lessons that scaffold, and the units scaffold, and the concept scaffold, the vocabulary scaffolds. And so that way there, students have a sense of momentum. We're not dwelling on a topic. They're engaged in the practices, and their interest and experience is building. When you look at these 2 pictures, this is the shift. The picture on the left is a teacher pre-teaching or doing a demonstration, which the students are expected to know and then replicate. The reality is it's not particularly interesting or engaging to do or repeat what somebody else has done. But furthermore, it's not engaging the students in the practices. It's simply kind of mirroring. On the right-hand side, the students haven't been shown what to do. They've been given a mission, and they've developed skills, and they're applying those skills in a specific sort of content space. And so now it's up to their partnership to make some decisions and actually carry out that mission, collect the data, and report back. That is effective STEM instruction. And so what you see there is very common of that sort of environment. The kind of resources that are out there right now in this context, I'd sort of categorize them this way. So there are awareness-ready resources, which really, it's like a trip to the museum. You know, as a result, you become aware of many new and different things. By seeing the electricity demonstration, you now know something about electricity, you're aware of it, but not as a student necessarily prepared to build a circuit. You might want to, you're aware, but the skills, the knowledge, it's not there. So that's awareness. So think the museum. Next, think about, or even companies, I throw that out there too. A lot of companies engage in STEM, and they want students to be aware of the opportunities, but they're not necessarily preparing them with the resource to take that opportunity in K-12. The next level is knowledge readiness. That's what you get from textbooks. So textbooks are great at telling us all about what scientists and engineers have done. So if you want to be knowledgeable about science and engineering, read a textbook. It's backward looking. When you come to performance readiness, that's what these kits that have been around since actually the late 60s, but 70s is where they kind of became really popular, things like STC and FOSS, and there's a million of them. They're not grade specific. They're kind of assigned to grade bands. You kind of do it whenever you want. It's a supplement and all that sort of stuff. That's gauged towards preparing students to perform a task in response to a specific question or need. So for instance, rocks and minerals. In an earth science sort of kit, there are rocks and minerals, and students learn if you want, a property of a rock and mineral is its hardness. If you want to find out how hard it is, you scratch that rock or scratch the mineral. Great. So they learn if you want to know how hard the rock is, you do a scratch test. They're performance ready then. Mastery readiness is really looking at students' skill set and mastering those science and engineering practice skills. Practices. Think of it like this. Let's take the kind of rock and mineral analogy a step further. John Doe's building a kitchen, and in that kitchen is going to put a countertop. He needs to decide which countertop is most durable, or he needs to install the most durable countertop. And so a student needs to potentially be able to help this contractor decide which countertop is most durable. So a student should be able to kind of look at that, look at the available materials, and say, okay, well, the question is, which material is most durable? And by the way, what do we mean by durability? Do we mean that it doesn't scratch? Do we mean that it doesn't cleave or fracture? Do we mean that it doesn't melt? And so by further defining the question, they need to be able to kind of come up with a model. So how would they plan an investigation of those materials? So let's say that they decide that it has to do with, how the material scratches. Student needs to be able to say, okay, well, in order, durability is really about how scratch resistant a surface is in a kitchen. So we're going to do this test, and here's how we're going to carry it out. And in that test, we're going to scratch, the different materials with these other materials which are commonly used in a kitchen. And so as a result, we're going to collect this type of data, and we're going to analyze that data and see which material is most scratch resistant, because the material which is most scratch resistant will be the most durable, and that's the one that the contractor should install. That, what I just described, that sort of scenario and skill set, that is mastery readiness from a next generation science standard sort of perspective. It's not about being able to regurgitate the definition or a fact. It's about being able to think like a scientist, think like an engineer, and engage with the concepts on that level, access them, and really participate in developing. So that's where we're coming from. So in No Adam's world, we really think of, so we've been at this for about 10 years, and we're actually located just north of Boston, so not far from New Hampshire. And so as an organization, the way we approach this is first through curriculum. So curriculum which is grade specific and with units that are intentionally ordered and nurture from September through June. And what happens is that equips the classroom from an operational standpoint to be able to deliver effective STEM instruction, because all the mapping's done, all the teacher background's there, all the lessons are there, and the materials that are needed, all of that's sort of laid out. And then what happens is through professional development, what we're doing is we're helping teachers map their existing skill sets to be able to create this next generation inquiry environment where those science domains come to life and students are able to access them. And so when you think about how next generation science resources or the next generation science standards will actually help new instruction in New Hampshire, it's really to take that inquiry silo that we have in New Hampshire and integrate it across all the other domains, which is what we should be doing anyways. We shouldn't be teaching earth science and then inquiry. We should be teaching the inquiry of earth science. But next generation science standards require that. It's not really an option. Right now, we could maybe argue that it's an option. So there's a professional development aspect of this. The other piece is the actual materials to carry out those investigations. So from a No Adam perspective, we kit all the materials up. They're unit specific, and they for classes of 12 or 15 or 30 or 25 or whatever. And so what you see in that picture is sort of materials for a year for a couple of classrooms. But it's all purposeful, and its purpose is to bring that STEM learning to life, to create that environment, to equip the teacher to be able to confidently and regularly deliver effective STEM instruction and engage in students where the students are at, and put the students in that role of scientist and engineer. And whatever resources you look at or develop moving forward as the standards change, or whether you decide to take next generation resources and use it as a way of teaching inquiry across the curriculum, it's it's something to keep in mind that these are the necessary components. Now, just as I'm wrapping up here, and I'm going to take questions in just a second, so if you have questions, please send those over. I know I've got a couple sitting here waiting. The idea that it's really not STEM, it's school, but we'll take a step further from STEM and we'll talk about STEAM, where we add art alongside science, technology, engineering, and math. This is Pablo Picasso's most famous work. It's called Guernica. And Guernica is, it's an oil on canvas painting that he did while he lived in exile in Paris, when there was all this conflict with the fascists back in Spain. And so when people talk about STEAM, so STEM and bringing art into it, a lot of times it ends up being window dressing. And the reason that it ends up there is that it gets sort of bogged down in this rut focused on the aesthetics of art, and sort of the approach commonly is, let's make things beautiful. Let's make the things that we create as engineers beautiful. And the thing is that engineers, by the way, are not people who build things. Things that are engineered are not always physical. Things that are engineered are software programs, which we can't touch. Yes, they're physical things like buildings have engineering involved, but they're also processes. So when students create a procedure, they're actually engineering something. Art is engineered communication. So when Pablo Picasso created this piece of artwork, which was his most famous work, he was engineering communication to his peers, to people that were alive at his time in 1937 when this was made, to talk about the atrocities of the fascists. There's nothing about this work that's particularly aesthetically pleasing. There's nothing about it that's particularly beautiful, but there's something about it that's communicating something very powerful about the effects of fascism in Guernica, which is that town in Spain, and the kind of atrocities that are being committed on everyday people and everyday life and animals. And when you approach art as a consumer using your critical thinking skills, those creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, you can really unpack what art truly is, and you can understand why great artists go to jail. Nobody goes to jail for making something beautiful, but for communicating something very powerful and potentially controversial, you can go to jail in the wrong places. On the other side, as a creator of art, you need those STEM practice skills, the precision. You need the higher order thinking skills to be able to create, evaluate, and analyze your message in the medium, in this case, oil on canvas. So in the classroom, the way this looks is not in an art context challenging students to make their creations in science beautiful. It's going beyond things like color theory. It's asking students to think critically about the art they're creating. Why are they choosing that color? Why did the author choose to make the character a wolf? Why is the author choosing a wolf to be the one knocking on the door of the House of the Pigs? And how does that make us feel? And so what we're doing is we're actually using those STEM skills to bring art alive and actually create more powerful communication, and communication that's in the form of music or in the form of a sculpture or a painting. Okay, and so those thinking skills, we're talking about art, but they go beyond that. I mean, they're history relevant as well. I mean, most people, and I'll end with this, show you a little bit of data, and we'll take the questions. Most people, get to Thanksgiving and they're talking about the Pilgrims, they're talking about Plymouth, but most people don't think about the Pilgrims having landed in Provincetown prior to moving to Plymouth. Why is it that those Pilgrims moved from Provincetown after crossing a treacherous voyage, crossing the Atlantic for religious freedom, to then up and leave where they land and go to Plymouth? So we can approach that issue scientifically and sort of critically and unpack history using our STEM practice skills and critical thinking skills. Was it the land? Was it the culture? Were there people there? Were the things that they were used to and needed in order to survive not present, such that they actually were compelled to move on? And we can actually look for clues in history. And so that's what makes learning really fantastic, are these skills, and that's why STEM matters. And so I'm just going to show you that quick data. So going all the way back, and this is some grade 4 data, to 2008, 2009, in New Hampshire, we were performing 10 to 30% higher than the state average by engaging students as scientists and engineers, just as you saw in that picture. And when you look at the subgroups, and this is all Kneecap results, you see students, and the students are in purple and yellow, and the state is in pink and in light blue, well outperforming the state in every section: physical science, earth science, life science, and inquiry, and really outperforming the state in inquiry. And the reason is that they were approaching the test from as scientists and engineers, taking those questions and problems apart. So when you think of that inquiry section, they were saying, oh, I'm being asked for facts relevant to the question, some research. I'm being asked for a hypothesis here. When I'm asked for a prediction, it's really a hypothesis. Oh, I'm following a procedure. I'm going to gather data, and I need to use key points of that data to support a claim. Oh, somebody else has a different claim. That's the new data that's been presented to me. I need to evaluate that and see sort of, is it rational or not? What's the source of data for their claim? And so those sort of thinking skills is why, even in the current standards on Kneecap, going as far back as 2008 and 2009, that we were getting these kind of results. And we see them in places like Massachusetts too. Here's the Massachusetts Common Assessment Program, an urban school district in Lynn, Massachusetts, where it's a UN High Council on Refugees relocation point. Something like 70% free and reduced lunch, 60% English language learners. We have some schools that are higher, even as high as 90% in these categories. This school went from 36% advanced proficient, or advanced is just another category for distinction in Massachusetts, to 87%, which is 50% higher than the state average. Mass average is about 50% proficient. And even in Kneecaps, most Kneecap states hover statewide proficiency levels right around 50%. So these are students who are refugees, English language learners, free and reduced lunch, so low socioeconomics, that are outperforming the average student in Massachusetts of much sort of more advantageous circumstances. In a place like Manchester by the Sea, which is sort of a community similar to like Newcastle or Rye, Manchester by the Sea, the average home price is something like $1.2 million. Very few English language learners, very few, if any, free and reduced lunch students. They see similar gains as a result of implementing STEM practices and this sort of next generation approach to inquiry, even under the existing standards. I think they got something like a 17-point gain the first year. And once you hit these 80+% proficiency levels, it's really about how far you can push the students, and the students just being spot on, because they're getting all their multiple choice questions. They're getting most of their open response inquiry questions. And those open response ones, if they slip up, that's where they slip up usually, and so they're higher point values, which is why you get into these 80s and 90s categories, and it can start to plateau, so you have to look for new strategies. Okay, so I'd like to take some questions now, and if I don't get to your question, feel free to email me directly. I'd like to also invite you, this Friday we have another webinar that's all about strategically implementing the next generation science standards, and that's something we're thinking about, as New Hampshire may go that route, but nonetheless, you can use really high quality next generation science resources as they emerge to support what you're doing already in New Hampshire and get higher results. So that's this Friday at 10 a.m. and the URL's right there, info.noadam.com/implementing, and you need those dashes, -NGSS, -practices, -webinar. And we're going to focus basically on 6 key areas: standards alignment, inquiry resources, redefining student-teacher roles, milestones for release of responsibility, data targets, and milestones. So without further ado, I'm going to go to my question list. If you have any questions, please send those along now. And oh, somebody would like to point out here just a nuance of where plants get their matter. So yes, they do also get it as a carbon-based life form from CO2. But plants are made of more than just carbon and oxygen. So they do actually need to get matter from the soil as well. Or nutrients, we would say perhaps, nutrients, which are either found in soil or, in the case of hydroponics, nutrients in the water itself. There's one question about resources regarding where you can see samples. If you go to the website, knowatom.com, KNOWATOM.com, you can access sample units. They're annotated, so it sort of explains, what's in that unit, what you're looking at. And the units that you'll be looking at are really, they cover a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks of content. Time on learning is something also worth mentioning here. At pre-K to second grade, the time on learning for science, all in, so the trade book reading you do in circle discussions, the little Socratic dialogues you have, experiments, prototypes, things like that, you're looking at an hour and a half to hour and 45 minutes a week minimum. You certainly could go a lot longer. It's hard to do it in less than that on a weekly basis. But again, when you're doing reading, that's ELA time. So it's a matter, in order to get that amount of time on a weekly basis, you really need to consider how you're leveraging ELA and math in the context of science as well. At the 3rd through 5th grade level, you're looking at more like 2.5 hours a week in order to accomplish that. And that's not trading off, you do half the year science and then do social studies half the year. That's all year long, 2.5 hours a week. And the reason is that to do the reading, to have a quality dialogue, to release the responsibility to the students so that they can engage those practices, develop labs, work hands-on, it takes that amount of time. It doesn't mean that, again, just like the earlier grades, that you don't need a block of 2.5 hours. It's 15 minutes here, it's 20 minutes there. You might need a block of 45 minutes to carry out an investigation. But again, you're training the students and thinking about the picture of, on the left and right of the teacher who's digging the hole versus the students who are working together to engineer a solution. It's not about a teacher regulating every student's behavior, saying, okay, we're all together now, I want you to see what I'm doing, and then I want you to do that, and when you're done, wait for me. Not that approach at all. We're talking about, okay, we've got this problem, we've got this question, now we're all on a mission. So, as with your partner, I want you to start a lab and check in with me after you have, gone through and generated your hypothesis, in which case, if they've met your expectations, you allow them to go on. And so you're facilitating an environment where the students really are acting like they're in a lab, and they're taking this very seriously. At a middle school, kind of high school level, that model that's common of 45 to 55 minutes a day, or even if you have a waterfall schedule with like hour-and-a-half blocks, this all fits in that. But again, it's a new, inquiry on an everyday basis is not necessarily what people are currently doing, because the current standards people can misinterpret and sort of teach inquiry kind of by itself, and then life science by itself, neuroscience by itself. So, if you're going to try to, if there is an environment where there's lots of worksheets going on and vocabulary drills and, memorization sort of exercises, and it's not about releasing responsibility to the student to engage in science and engineering, then you're going to have a hard time fitting this in, because there's not going to be time for both. And the reality is that the value isn't in the memorization. The value is really in engaging science and engineering in context and developing knowledge and skills that way. Okay, any other questions here? Let's see, we have one around cost of resources and grants. So cost of resources, that really depends. Rural schools with 12 students are going to have different resource requirements than Manchester with large urban classrooms and, dozens and hundreds of classrooms. So the best way to deal with that is reach out to Mary Ellen. Her email's there mdelacy@noatom.com, and her phone number 617-475-3475, extension 2006. She can answer those questions for you. Regarding grants, we don't have grants. What we do have is resources to help you sort of draft grants, understand what that process looks like. And so if you have like the friends of whatever public schools, or if there's sort of a company in your region or parent group, PTO, that gives money to things, we have a section of our website at noatom.com that talks about grants and how to sort of structure your grant well so that you're able to get that grant funding. If you do go for a grant for NoAtom materials, we'll also sort of give you a peer review and suggest edits if you want that. Other things, let's see here in the question list. It's a question about students, so special ed students. So special ed students in this kind of environment, so the question has to do with how you treat. So special ed students in this environment, the way that works is it works really well, and here's why, and here's how it looks, I guess, maybe a little differently. So students, let's say, with language-based learning disabilities, in this environment, instruction is not entirely text-based, so that if a student can't read a text, they can't access the content, because you're making it something that's auditory and sort of in discussion. You're making something that's hands-on, and you're engaging that student basically in different modalities. In order to sort of, how does a student keep a lab notebook? Well, they do to the best of their ability. Now, if a student can't write at all, they are recording their ideas somehow. So that may be on an iPad, it might be laptop, something like that. That's fine. They may have a scribe. That's fine as well. The key here is that they're contributing their ideas. Now, if you think about English language learners, students who really haven't mastered English yet, but they're sort of mainstreamed, they're in an English instructional environment, students are always, and this is what our data shows, is that students are always conversational first. And so by, again, taking it out of that text-based environment, making it hands-on, discussing, students are acquiring new words. They're using the words they do have in conversation. They're not being limited in their ability to sort of string sentences together in written form. And they're getting immediate successes through being able to create and still contribute their ideas to their partnership and the classroom. That's all really important. The other thing, especially for folks who have are coming from like an urban environment where you might have larger classrooms or substantially separate classrooms of English language learners. Students oftentimes in those environments, so let's say you have 3 students who speak the same language, they'll oftentimes have conversations and help each other out, sort of helping kind of explain in their own native language what's going on. Well, that's good and not so good. So it's good because the student's getting help. It's not so good because the student's doing it in their native language and they're not acquiring the English words for what they're seeing. Well, in this case, by making something hands-on and actually inquiry-oriented this way, the kind of content that you're able to cover is content at a depth that the children don't typically have words to describe it, which means that they then have to reach out in English and basically capture that new word and add it to their vocabulary. And we've seen that pretty powerfully in urban settings as well, where nobody has the word for this, and so now it's sort of like this new cool word we all know and we're using it. By the way, it's an English word, and we have a very clear context for it. So nonetheless, it's a great question. We have another, I'll give another minute or two if there's any other questions out there. Looks like we've covered most of these. If you have any other questions that come up, again, feel free to reach out. We're just down the road from you. Email or call. If you'd like, we do have that sort of it's the final webinar in the series, which is strategically implementing the next generation science standards. When we follow up, we will send you a recording of this webinar along with a couple other resources, a quick rubric for sort of looking at your existing curriculum and seeing how well it aligns to next generation science standards. And also, there's a PD video that's free that we'll show you and give you access to, and a walk through what a next generation science unit looks like from a student's perspective and from a teacher's perspective. And that's a real up-close look in terms of here's what they're doing and here's what the resource looks like in order to back that up. And so we'll provide those. Keep an eye out either today or tomorrow. You should get that email. Otherwise, thank you for joining us, and have a great start to your school year and a wonderful weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.